Well, hello, everybody. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm President and CEO of the Asian Society. Welcome to our series of conversations on Asian Americans building America. These are folks from all sorts of backgrounds right across this vast, and from my perspective as an Australian, pretty interesting country, which you call the US. And they're making positive impacts right across America. Today, we're joined by Cecillia Wang, who's Deputy Legal Director and Director of the Center for Democracy at the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. Cecillia, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Cecillia, anti-Asian racism, complicated topic. Tell me, first of all, personally, how are you coping with all this and in your position in the ACLU?
So as a personal matter, I grew up in the Bay Area, suburbs of San Francisco in the 70s and 80s. And so anti-Asian bias, verbal attacks, harassment, and even violence are nothing new for most Asian Americans. It's something that we grow up with and have to cope with and deal with throughout our lives. I think what was particularly disturbing about this recent spate of anti-Asian attacks, or really more it's a spate of reporting than perhaps anything unusual in terms of the frequency, is that, it really did seem to be spurred by the President of the United States as he was talking about COVID-19 and blaming Asians in general for the pandemic. So
it was pretty, as I saw it, pretty gross. The kung flu and all that sort of stuff. Basically, we got a problem with the pandemic. Find an Asian American, it's their fault. That seemed to be his political text, if I got it right.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's what was particularly disturbing about it. And it came along with other anti-immigrant statements and policy positions that the Trump administration took. So in context, I think that's what's been particularly disturbing, and the viciousness of some of these attacks that have tended to be against particularly vulnerable members of our community, elderly, low income, and immigrant Asian Americans, is also disturbing. On the professional front, as a civil rights lawyer at the ACLU, we normally are tackling issues that have to do with government discrimination, violations of due process, and other US constitutional provisions. And so I think this issue is one that, as we've had a change in administration, is one that is complicated to tackle. And, to keep it on the personal level as a civil rights lawyer, and not necessarily in my capacity as an ACLU lawyer, I think it's, we have an important role to play in talking about the ways in which knee-jerk responses, such as greater criminal penalties based on motivation, might not be the best idea, especially in a day and age when people are taking a hard look at the criminal legal system and at whether incarceration or other criminal penalties and coercive penalties imposed by the government are the best way to tackle this sort of societal problem or crime, as the case may be.
It's going to be my next question, actually. I'm neither a lawyer nor an American, but I've been living among you for quite some time. And coming from politics myself, I know a truckload of lawyers.
I'm so sorry.
Well, I could say, like politics, it can be a noble profession, but not necessarily so. But how robust are the laws, both federally and state in the United States, in dealing with, let's call it, hate crime?
Well, my personal view is that the criminal laws are robust enough. When there is a crime, when there is a violent act that is carried out on someone, prosecutors at the state and federal level have the tools they need to address those individual attacks. I think the harder question is, what is the role of the federal government or of state, federal, local government officials in addressing, again, something that's a societal problem, something that is a cultural issue, something that is part of what is unfortunately a long legacy of anti-Asian bias and racism in our country. And I think the government officials who have the bully pulpit, really have a role to play in setting the tone. And I particularly appreciate statements that President Biden has made since taking office to try to address this issue at the roots. But again, I think there's a lot of history that is not taught in schools in our country. Not only about Asian Americans, but African Americans as descendants of slaves, Latino, indigenous people in our country. And if that education were to be improved, if there were fora for these issues to be discussed on the community level, and if people who are in a position to seize the bully pulpit can take leadership and ownership over the issue and start that dialogue publicly, I think that would go a longer way toward stopping these attacks than trying to call for changes in legislation, hate crimes penalties, and that sort of more carceral solution. If I were a member of Congress, that's how I would look at it.
It's interesting what you say, and that is that the capacity of the statute to actually handle this is reasonable. What you're saying is what needs to rise to the occasion is political leadership around the statute and around the norms which underpin the statute. Political leadership, in my own experience, actually matters on race questions. It really is at a very normative level, at a psychological level and at a sociological level, it sets the goalposts for what's acceptable human behaviour. And when you start having political leaders who open the door ever so narrowly and then more broadly to the acceptability of racism, then it tends to run away with you and it tends to have a huge effect. So I think your comments there, in my own experience of the United States and my own country, are right on the money. Tell me about your own story. Where you come from, been in the States, where's the family from, and all that sort of stuff.
So I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in a suburb called Fremont, which has kind of an interesting, tie-in to Asian America. I graduated my school in 1988, a large public high school. And when I graduated out of a school of about 1,600 students spread out over grades 9 through 12, it was over 90% white. And I remember that because I was an editor on the school paper. And I remember looking at the data that the school district had and doing a report on faculty diversity versus the student body diversity. And of the remaining, 8 or 9% of the school population that was not white, we were mostly Asian American. Today, my high school is about 85% Asian American, about evenly split between Chinese American and South Asian American. And I think, my story.
Silicon Valley in training, is that what you're saying?
It is part of Silicon Valley, actually. It is a bedroom community of Silicon Valley. And I think, the story of where I come from is partly about growing up in the United States at a time of rapid demographic change that came with a lot of anti-Asian bias on the schoolyard and in the community where my parents and I lived. My parents immigrated from Taiwan. They were both born in mainland China and with their families went to Taiwan when they were very young children and grew up in Taiwan and then came here in 1968 after the US immigration codes were really lifted anti-Asian quotas. And so I like to say that I am an American today because of the work of African-American civil rights leaders who fought for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Immigration Act of 1965, which I really see as part and parcel of those civil rights laws that lifted those racial quotas on immigration to the United States. That's my story. So I grew up in the Bay Area. Yeah.
You're a child of MLK then, so it's it's good to see. So you grew up in a Chinese-speaking household, or were they speaking Taiwanese?
My parents spoke Chinese. They did not speak Taiwanese fluently since they were from the mainland originally.
So they were Waishanren, not Banshanren.
That's right. Right. We were Waishanren, or they were, I should say. It's funny, you know, I did grow up speaking Chinese, and when I was very young, during preschool, I had a babysitter who was Cantonese. She spoke Cantonese, and her parents spoke Toisan. And so I was told by my parents that when I was that age, 4 or 5 years old, I actually spoke Mandarin, Cantonese, and Toisan. And now I'm not fluent in any of those and don't understand Toisan or Cantonese. But yeah, it's interesting thinking about that linguistic legacy and the ways in which fluency, you know, I lost the fluency in Mandarin. And my parents, you know, my mother passed away 3 years ago, my dad is still alive, but I grew up after, I would say, you know, starting maybe in junior high school, we switched to speaking in English to each other. And I lost my fluency in Mandarin. And so I bet you are much more fluent in Mandarin than I am. And it's, you know, it has a lot of...
It depends, Cecilia, how much I've had to drink.
Does it get better or worse with?
Well,
is there some sort of bell curve?
I reckon it gets better because I can remember less of what I actually said.
Right.
Tell me about pride, pride in being in America, because national identity, pride in being an American, pride in being an Asian American. What's it feel like today in the 21st century?
It feels very strong to me. I think, you know, there's a lot that is changing among scholars and artists who are forging, you know, what Asian American identity means. My friend Viet Nguyen, the novelist and literary critic and Asian American studies scholar, has written a lot about this that I agree with. And, you know, I think Asian American communities are, as you know, so diverse. It's really a politically forged identity that, you know, resonates with some people. I identify as Asian American. I feel very strongly that there is this simpatico, that there are common interests, common experiences among diverse groups of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Other people don't feel that way. For example, my parents, who are immigrants, and other relatives who were part of that immigrant generation to the U.S. from Taiwan, you know, probably don't feel so much in common with an Indian American, you know, someone who's Filipino American. And so I think it's a complicated story, but there is pride there. I think there's so much that, you know, we don't have a lot of political power because our numbers are small in the US, but I think that we do have a significant role to play in my field of civil rights, where there are a lot of Asian American lawyers working for the cause of racial justice more generally, not just on behalf of Asian Americans, but just trying to calibrate our laws so that the stated ideals of our Constitution and laws are a lived reality for everyone. That's something we have to constantly work at. And I think, you know, I take a lot of pride in doing that as an Asian American civil rights attorney.
I think it's terrific the work you're doing, because you're second and third generation MLK types, which is, you know, these things come in waves, and everyone, each generation, and not just African Americans, but across, let's call it minorities, is sort of rising to the new challenge and rising to the new cause, and then doing their bit to change the world. And then we'll see our kids do the same. It's kind of, as others have said more eloquently than myself, the arc of history bends slowly towards justice. But for that to happen, it's not just a natural process. Each of us has got to pitch in to keep it rolling that way. Last question I've got for you is this. If you people watching this YouTube are listening to this highly articulate, Chinese American woman who's a civil rights lawyer over there on the West Coast, somewhere in the Bay Area. What's your advice to someone who is on the receiving end of a racial taunt or an act of racial violence tomorrow? What would your advice to them be about what to do, how to handle it?
You know, it's so difficult to give general advice as a lawyer. I think based on my personal experience on the receiving end of that kind of attack or verbal harassment, the first thing is to be safe, to look out for your physical safety. And I think the second thing is to, join in with there are Asian Americans and other people of color around the US who are organizing to find community-based solutions to this wave of racial violence. And I think finding community with others is a key piece of the solution. And I think, the question that is equally important is not just what advice do I give to Asian Americans who find themselves on the receiving end, but what advice do we give to all Americans who might be witnesses to such attacks?
Exactly.
That's right.
Mm. So, final question: what gives you hope?
It gives me hope that so many people are engaged in such good work to really, fulfill the promises of our country. It gives me hope to see generation after generation of newly arrived immigrants who are on the path to becoming Americans or coming here as new Americans. And all the work that we do together in communities around the country really gives me hope. Through the 4 years of the Trump administration, which were really terrible days, I think, for our country and for the cause of civil rights and constitutional rights, we never lost that hope. That was always there. That expressed itself in the crowds of people who took to the streets and the airports to support immigrants and refugees. And that's where I look for hope to my fellow compatriots in the movement.
Well said, my friend. Cecillia Wang, thank you very much for being with us today and for all the work that you're doing with the ACLU. We appreciate all you're doing also to pave the way for Asian Americans for the future. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm with the Asian Society. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.